Welcome to Convergence.fm. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanand. On the show, we explore how purpose-driven leaders align their culture, operations, and experimentation to de-risk the decisions that really matter and lead AI-enabled businesses with clarity. Convergence.fm. Transform from the inside out. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Convergence.fm. Today we're going to talk about a problem that we've seen surfacing pretty often with CEOs who haven't had a ton of experience with shipping software, but are curious about how technology and AI could help their businesses. The problem came about during a workshop that we recently did with a CEO of a medical device company. They had acquired this company a couple of years ago, and one of their post-acquisition strategies on increasing the value of this business was by making it more tech-enabled. And the specific problem within their operations we talked about was something that was involving extremely expensive talent at their company being used to do very compliance-heavy type of documentation and paperwork. And this kind of work involved a lot of variance in terms of how quickly different folks were able to get it done for different situations. There was a lot of training required and updated training as the regulations changed. And then thirdly, there was also a lot of rework that all led to a ton of costs and profitability leaks for the business. Now, something like this has a lot of the components that suggest that this could be a technology solve. That's a repeatable knowledge work here done by really expensive talent or knowledge workers that carries a high amount of variance and rework that usually says that, hey, maybe this latest paradigm of AI might be worth pursuing in terms of whether we can reduce this variance, reduce this cost. The other thing about this problem that I found really interesting was that it was something that was going to increase in terms of how painful it was as this company grew. As they added more customers, there'd be higher volume of this problem, as well as higher complexity with the different things that new customers brought about. So it's one of those problems that we're going to scale with growth and become more and more of a challenge as the company did all the right things on the growth side and the sales and marketing side. Now, despite their hunches about whether technology could solve it, which I think they were on the right track, I think they were pretty overwhelmed with how to go about solving it, and we'll get into that. And one of the things that I think further challenged and made this a hard to get started on thing was that the CEO really wanted this company to be tech-enabled. And it's an ambiguous term in terms of what tech-enabled means. Now, from an investor standpoint, it makes a ton of sense because tech-enabled companies are generally given higher valuation multiples. But how to go about building a tech-enabled company can seem a little bit ambiguous in terms of how to get started. In this case, they had a notion that they had to have a CTO in-house on their C-suite. They needed to have a ton of engineers. They needed to own technology IP. And these things, I think, were further clouding their ability to get started on how to solve this problem. So during the workshop, what we started with was, before even getting to build versus buy, we started with problem sizing and making sure that this was, in fact, a problem worth solving. So we did some really quick math, in part to get our team up to speed in terms of how much this was costing the company in the lens of how big of an opportunity it could be from a technology solve. And the CEO continued to feel pretty confident that, yeah, this is the top 2 or 3 things that we can solve today that's going to have a very immediate impact to our bottom line in 2026. So I want everyone to remember that making sure you're working on problems worth solving is typically the first step to getting a lot of leverage or return on investment from your technology initiatives. The second thing was getting to build versus buy. Why not buy or rent the software? Well, the software options that they had available from various SaaS companies seemed kind of expensive. There was an upfront implementation cost that you couldn't recoup. And then oftentimes, most of these vendors also have 12-month minimum commitments in order to get started. And adding up that implementation cost to the minimum 12-month commitment seems like a pretty arduous investment, especially in the lens of like feeling like a compromise that, hey, I'm trying to build a technology enabled company. Does it really count as technology enablement if I'm using off the shelf software versus having our own? So what we did is we continued this math that we had done on the whiteboard, and we added some conservative estimates and assumptions around how much of a lift technology might have. And then what we realized was that despite this, 12-month commitment and another upfront implementation that was about 15, that was another like 3 to 4 months that would lead to about 15 to 16 months of real cost commitment. We realized that for the given volume and the conservative estimate around how much lift the software could have, that they would actually break even in 3 to 4 months. So the first thing we did was sort of had a debate with the CEO in terms of what the commitment really was. And he tended to agree after seeing the math on the whiteboard that, yeah, really the commitment is to break even versus the financial commitment that we have on contract with this vendor. So what this surfaced was that this ideology that the CEO had around wanting to be technology enabled was proving to be very expensive for them, especially given that it was also driving indecision. And every month that they weren't solving this expensive problem was that much more of a hit to their EBITDA, their bottom line, and everything else. The second thing is that, we put some conservative estimates in place that seem to make sense from a business standpoint as to whether technology could solve this viably for our business. And then from a lens of design thinking, if we check off the business viability, that leaves 2 new questions. And that is customer desirability. And in this case, this was an in-house customer or user, their employees that were going to be using it. And then the second thing was technology feasibility. Can this technology actually feasibly solve their problem where it continues to dovetail into their process while actually meeting the conservative estimates that we put into place? In this case, the customer desirability, I think, is a little bit less risky for 2 reasons. Number one, this was internal, and you have a little bit more control over your internal employees and asking them to use this new technology and getting their feedback, which can be pretty clear, versus when you put something in front of your customers, you have no control over your customers, and the feedback loop can be a little bit more ambiguous there. The second thing here is that their employees were also pretty frustrated. This compliance-heavy documentation work was not what these high-paid employees wanted to do. It was a necessary evil of their job. So, that felt like it wasn't the biggest risk compared to the technology feasibility. Can this SaaS company and their software actually solve the problem that we want? And how do we find out? And so what we arrived at here is giving them a little bit more lever to go back and negotiate with this SaaS company, and while being reasonable. So the SaaS company understandably wants a 12-month commitment, and so do we if the solution works. And then understandably integrating to all the other systems so the documentation is pulled and pushed in an automated way does require some upfront implementation and integration. But the question here doesn't require this commitment or this integration. The question really is, hey, if I input these documents into your system, does it give us the output that we're looking for? And if it does, then it proves out what we need to know. And we want to sign this 12-month commitment. We want to get this implementation done as quickly as possible because we know it's going to drive business value right away. So essentially, we created a negotiation to go back and say, hey, we're willing to pay for a pilot for 1 month in this case, where you don't do any of the implementation and integration yet. You give us access to a sandbox where we can input these documents and criteria, and we help them through the workshop with identifying the right criteria of which different documents to put in. And then what is the output from your system? And we also help them during the workshop that, hey, we're not looking for perfection here. We're looking for where the leverage comes compared to this really expensive manual costs that you have for your employees. And so in both cases, moving the needle just a little bit, making sure you're covering enough ground and covering enough of the inputs, as well as being kind of reasonable in terms of the outputs, allowed us to not look for precision, but just making sure we're being accurate and thinking about this as business people so they could go back and get moving in terms of this conversation with this vendor. And there's a few others in this space that they could potentially work with. And the thing I want to remind here is that renting SaaS instead of building it in-house isn't giving up control. It's sequencing your problems and their solutions so that you can stop the bleeding right away. And in this case, presumably, if this proof of concept works and they move to implementation and they get this ROI really quickly, what this does is it clears up both financial and emotional space by stopping the bleeding, which then allows you to think more long-term and strategic about, hey, is this the type of software, is this the type of problem that's worth someday bringing in-house? And part of what we educated the CEO and gave them perspective is how owning intellectual property and custom software is very much like a liability of owning machinery. It depreciates as soon as you buy it. It requires ongoing care and maintenance and a maintenance team to do that. And so not saying whether you should or should not, but saying that, hey, we need to think about those trade-offs as well as we decide whether something is worth building in-house or something is worth just continuing to rent, right? And in this case, there were two factors that made it really obvious that this is something that was worth pursuing custom intellectual property development. The first one we actually already kind of touched on, in that this is a problem that was going to compound with their growth. And there was going to be more complexity that came with more customers in addition to the volume of customers that led to this problem being a lot worse. And there was a lot of levers for differentiation there in their operating model that they could bring into being. And this was something that the CEO had in their vision of having a differentiated operating model that they were going to change about this business once they made the acquisition to help them really scale a lot faster and grow better in the industry. The other thing that the CEO had in their vision was changing their customer experience. And this technology and this problem actually was relatively close enough to this new customer experience that they had in mind that it felt like, when looking around corners, that relying on someone outsourced and just their APIs versus having full control over how the software works was totally warranted in the lens of where they wanted to differentiate. So those couple of questions helped us determine that, hey, while we've stopped the bleeding, this is something that's worth solving in the long term by bringing in-house. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Now that we've decided that this is worth building in-house, he wanted to understand which levers to pull and how to go about getting started. Do we hire an in-house CTO and have them build a team to do this? Do we hire an onshore boutique expert consultancy? Do we go offshore? What are our options? And these are all very good options for different circumstances. In this case, we arrived at this option of hiring a boutique consultancy that could act as their super high-performing software team, including a CTO, all the way down to developing the software, but with the caveat and understanding that when the time felt right and we had enough space, budget, and other things, we would be hiring our own in-house team that would replace that boutique. Now, I want to say that I'm a little bit biased about this model because it was very much our business model at Integral. And while I don't run Integral anymore, we partner with a ton of boutiques that continue to operate under this model where initially they will act as your high performing team. They will teach your business and your employees how to interact and best collaborate with a high performing software team so that when you're ready to hire your in-house team, you've already developed the ergonomics, momentum, and discipline around how to best collaborate with technologists. They can help you with hiring them. And then the third thing I like in this case is that parallelizing this work allowed us to understand so much more about the business problem, the domain, while renting to learn, so that when it comes to building the stuff in-house, you're building way less software because you can be way more opinionated about what really needs to be built, what the nice to haves are that can be ignored for now compared to the core things that we really need. And that drives down time to value. It drives down your cost of owning this custom IP and allows you to save budget for further innovating a lot more. The third thing that we did here was we created an open rec with them for someone who wasn't quite a CTO, but an in-house prototyper. So this was someone who was able to either build customer-facing prototypes using things like Lovable, Bolt, Replit, using vibe coding. So you could go test it with actual customers, or you could build workflow automation using platforms like N8N or Langflow so that you can test the feasibility of other workflow automation that AI and technology could help. And this wasn't ever going to be production software, but it was going to give the CEO real-time validated capital allocation insights in terms of where to allocate budget for software and where to go about trying to solve problems a non-technical way. And so this was the third thing that we came up with, where this would be someone who's very hands-on, worked very closely with the CEO, but didn't cost quite as much as a CTO did, and didn't necessarily have, and you weren't paying for things like management skills that you didn't necessarily need because this person was someone who was working really fast and could be very hands-on. So hopefully by now you've realized, like the CEO has, that it's not just about build versus buy. It's about problem sizing and making sure you're working on really the really expensive problems, whether it's from a cost or an opportunity cost standpoint, and ignoring everything else so you can preserve your focus on the things where the juice is most worth the squeeze. It's about looking at the types of problems and seeing whether these are problems that are going to go away with growth or problems like this one that compound with growth. If they're going to go away with growth, you're better off investing in more growth and getting there faster versus this one that's going to become a really big growth constraint for you later on that is totally warranted in terms of investing early and solving and getting off the books. It's also about how differentiating problems and their solutions are worth ownership of IP compared to ones that are non-differentiating that you'd much rather rent. It's about how being smart and surgical about your sequencing can help you negotiate trade-offs a lot better. And getting to that is talking about the trade-offs versus the options, right? If we just talked about the various options in front of them, it would be hard to negotiate versus coming down to the true trade-offs between them and then prioritizing amongst those allows for the sequencing in a more surgical way that gives them the best of both worlds, where they're stopping the bleeding today while also getting a better sense of what building a tech-enabled business is in the long term. And speaking of technology-enabled, building a technology-enabled business is certainly favored by investors and going to increase the valuation of your business. But versus thinking about just that downstream, I think thinking about what leverage you can get from technology today. How can you do more with less because of technology is really a much easier question to ask, and chasing after those answers are going to ultimately get you a lot faster to building a technology-enabled business versus more ambiguous definitions like how many engineers you've hired or how much IP you've invested in or how qualified your CTO is. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Very smart CEOs like this individual get stuck all the time when it comes to solving big, gnarly business problems where technology can play a part. And so If that sounds like something that you're trying to get yourself unstuck from, hit us up for an office hours session. Listeners of the show get office hours for free. Hit us up at officehours@convergence.fm via email, and someone will get back to you to help schedule some time. Oftentimes, 30 minutes is plenty for us to understand where you're at, what you're stuck by, and get you moving along with going down a path of solutioning versus being stuck in that overwhelm and indecision. Otherwise, we will be back next week with another episode of Convergence.fm, and we'll see you then. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.